June 4, 1942. Over the Pacific, 30 miles north of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Commander John Thach gripped the control stick of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, sweat soaking through his flight suit despite the frigid air at 10,000 feet. Behind him, 15 to 20 Japanese Zeros dove from the sun, their wings reflecting light like predatory birds descending on prey. His radio crackled. Ensign Ram Dibb's voice, tight with fear, cut through the static. A Zero was on his tail. In that moment, everything Thach had worked out on his kitchen table in Coronado months earlier would either save their lives or become meaningless theory written in his blood across the Pacific sky. They called it the most maneuverable fighter in the world, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. When it first appeared in the skies over China in 1940, Allied intelligence dismissed the reports as exaggeration. No fighter could possess such range, such speed, such turning ability. The laws of aerodynamics made it impossible, but the laws of aerodynamics had not accounted for Japanese engineering audacity. By December 1941, when Zero swept over Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific, American pilots learned a brutal truth. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter. It could outclimb them. At low speeds, it dominated the sky with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Pilots who tried to dogfight a Zero in the traditional way died. It was that simple. The Zero emerged from an impossible requirement. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a carrier-based fighter that could fly over 300 miles per hour, climb to nearly 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes, possess a range exceeding 1,500 miles, and turn tighter than anything in the sky. Most aircraft designers declared it impossible. Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi, said yes. His solution was radical. Strip away everything that was not absolutely essential. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Use a revolutionary aluminum alloy developed in secret Japanese laboratories. Design a wing so efficient that it generated lift at impossibly low speeds. Build the entire airframe lighter than seemed possible. The result was an aircraft that weighed just over 4,000 pounds empty. Its competitors weighed nearly twice that. When the A6M Zero entered service in 1940, it represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation philosophy: offense over defense, maneuverability over protection, range over survivability. The Zero's Sakai radial engine produced only 940 horsepower, but in a fighter this light it was enough. Top speed reached 331 miles per hour, service ceiling exceeded 33,000 feet. But these numbers told only part of the story. What made the Zero legendary was its turn radius. At low speeds, it could complete a full turn in half the distance of any American fighter. A pilot trying to follow a Zero through a hard turn found himself helplessly exposed, his aircraft shuddering on the edge of a stall, while the Zero gracefully reversed position and lined up the killing shot. The Zero's armament reflected Japanese tactical doctrine. Two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose provided steady fire for aiming. Two 20mm cannons in the wings delivered devastating stopping power. But the cannons carried only 60 rounds each, giving the pilot perhaps 10 seconds of cannon fire before they ran dry. The Zero was a sniper's weapon. Precise, deadly, unforgiving of waste. Japanese pilots trained in tactics that maximized these strengths. They flew in loose formations that allowed individual pilots to exploit the Zero's maneuverability. They sought turning fights where American pilots, bound by the weight and inertia of their heavier aircraft, could not follow. In the first 6 months of the war, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible. 12-1 against Allied fighters. Reports filtered back from pilots who survived encounters with the Zero. The stories were consistent. If you tried to turn with it, you died. Lieutenant Commander Thach knew his Wildcat was outmatched. The F-4F was a solid aircraft, rugged and reliable, but it was no dancer. With 650 caliber machine guns in the wings and armor plate behind the pilot, it weighed 7,900 pounds fully loaded. Its Pratt & Whitney radial engine produced 1,200 horsepower, giving it respectable performance, but its top speed of 318 miles per hour lagged behind the Zero. Its turn radius was wider, its climb rate slower. In a traditional dogfight, turning and twisting at low speeds, the Zero held every advantage. Thach understood this with painful clarity. He had read the intelligence reports from the Philippines, from Wake Island, from the Coral Sea. American pilots were dying because they fought the Zero on its terms, so Thach changed the terms. In the summer of 1941, before America entered the war, he received a report from the Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bureau describing the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability. He spent his evenings in his home in Coronado, working with matchsticks on his kitchen table, moving them around, testing formations, searching for something that would give his pilots a chance. The traditional defensive tactic was the Lufbery circle, where fighters flew in a continuous turn for mutual support. But if the Zero could outturn the Wildcat, it would simply get inside the circle and pick off aircraft one by one. Thach needed something different, something that turned the Wildcat's disadvantages into advantages. He called it the beam defense position. Others would call it the Thach Weave. The concept was elegant. Two Wildcats flew side by side, separated by a distance equal to the Wildcat's turning radius, roughly 600 feet. When a Zero attacked one of the Wildcats, both American planes turned toward each other. The Zero pilot faced a choice: break off the attack or press it and fly directly into the gun sights of the second Wildcat turning toward him. If the Zero pilot committed to the attack on the first Wildcat, he flew into a head-on engagement with the second. If he broke off, the American pilots crossed paths, reversed direction, and were ready to repeat the maneuver. The Thach Weave exploited two Wildcat advantages the Zero could not match. The F-4F's heavier construction allowed it to maintain higher speeds in a turn without falling into a stall, and its .650 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower that could shred the Zero's unarmored airframe. Thach tested his theory with Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, an aggressive young pilot who would later receive the Medal of Honor. O'Hare played the role of the Zero, trying everything to break through the weave. He could not. Every attack run ended with him staring down the barrel of the second Wildcat's guns. Thach knew he had something. But theory on a training range and reality in combat were different worlds. At Midway, he would find out which one mattered. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Thach led 6 Wildcats off the deck of the Yorktown. Their mission was to escort 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carrier fleet. The Devastators were death traps, slow and vulnerable, and everyone knew it. The Wildcats would be their only protection. Below them, the Pacific stretched in every direction, a blue emptiness broken only by the wakes of Japanese warships. Then the Zeros came. They dove from above, from out of the sun, 15 to 20 of them, and the air exploded into chaos. Ensign Edgar Bassett's Wildcat took hits immediately, flames erupting from the engine, the plane tumbling toward the sea. Lieutenant Brainerd Macomber's radio went dead, his wings stitched with bullet holes. The Zero swarmed like hornets, attacking from every angle. Thach called to Ensign Dibb. They began the weave. Dibb broke right, extending the distance between them. A Zero latched onto Dibb's tail, the Japanese pilot confident, closing for the kill. Thach turned hard toward Dibb. The geometry played out exactly as he had visualized on his kitchen table. The Zero, focused on Dibb, suddenly found Thach's Wildcat rushing toward him head-on. Thach's .650 caliber machine guns erupted. Tracers reached across the sky. The Zero's cowling shattered, pieces flying off, flames blooming from the engine. The Zero rolled and fell away, trailing black smoke. Dibb reversed his turn. They crossed paths. Another Zero dove after Macomber. Thach and Dibb wove again, the two Wildcat scissors back and forth, creating a wall of crossing fire that no Zero could penetrate. Thach shot down a second Zero, then a third. The Japanese pilots, confused by this unfamiliar tactic, broke off their attacks. The weave worked, not perfectly. They lost Bassett. Macomber's plane was shot up badly. But they survived. More importantly, while Thach's little group of Wildcats fought for their lives, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared overhead, diving on the now unprotected Japanese carriers below. In 5 minutes, they gutted 3 carriers. The Battle of Midway turned on those 5 minutes. Thach and his pilots landed back on Yorktown, their aircraft riddled with bullet holes, fuel tanks nearly empty, ammunition expended. Thach filed his report. The Thach Weave was not theoretical anymore. It was proven in the blood and fire of combat. But the weave was only part of the answer. The deeper solution to the Zero problem came from understanding what the Wildcat could do that the Zero could not. And that understanding came from 1,200 miles southwest, over the jungles and rice paddies of southern China, where another group of American pilots had been fighting the Japanese since before Pearl Harbor. They called themselves the American Volunteer Group. The world called them the Flying Tigers. Their commander was Claire Chennault, a former Army Air Corps captain who had resigned his commission and gone to China to help the nationalist Chinese build an air force. Chennault was a fighter tactician, obsessed with the science of aerial combat. When he learned he would be fighting Japanese aircraft, he studied everything available about them. He understood the Zero's strengths. He also understood its weaknesses. Chennault's pilots flew the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, an aircraft even less suited to dogfighting than the Wildcat. The P-40 was heavy, nearly 9,000 pounds loaded, powered by an Allison V15C Nunen engine producing 1,040 horsepower. Top speed was 360 miles per hour, faster than the Zero in level flight. But in a turn, the P-40 was hopeless. Its wide turning radius and heavy controls made it easy prey for the nimble Japanese fighters. So he taught them to refuse the dogfight entirely. His doctrine was simple and absolute. Never try to turn with a Japanese fighter. Never. Use altitude. Use speed. Attack from above in a high-speed dive. Fire a short burst and keep going. Use the P-40's superior dive speed and structural strength to escape. Climb back up. Attack again. The Japanese pilots, trained in swirling knife-fight engagements, found themselves unable to respond. The P-40 had advantages the Japanese did not expect. Its heavy construction meant it could dive faster than the Zero without the aircraft coming apart. The Zero's lightweight airframe made high-speed dives dangerous. Above 200 knots, the Zero's ailerons locked up, making it sluggish in roll maneuvers. The P-40 rolled beautifully at high speeds. The Zero's float carburetor caused the engine to cut out under negative G-forces. The P-40's engine kept running. Chennault's pilots learned to enter a dive, push the stick forward to create negative Gs, and the pursuing Zero's engine would quit, giving them precious seconds to escape. These were not small advantages. They were decisive. Chennault trained his pilots in formation tactics that multiplied their effectiveness. They flew in two-plane elements with a third aircraft flying top cover. If a Zero got on one pilot's tail, his wingman was positioned to deliver supporting fire. The Flying Tigers never flew alone. They never fought fair. They attacked from surprise, hit hard, and disappeared before the Japanese could react. The Chinese warning network of coast watchers gave Chennault's pilots advance notice of Japanese raids. They would be waiting at altitude when the Japanese arrived. On December 20, 1941, 13 days after Pearl Harbor, the Flying Tigers flew their first combat mission over Kunming, China. 10 Japanese bombers approached the city, escorted by fighters. 4 P-40s dove through the formation, guns blazing. 4 bombers fell from the sky. The rest jettisoned their bombs and fled. Not a single P-40 was lost. The Flying Tigers had announced themselves. Over the next 7 months, until the AVG was disbanded and absorbed into the Army Air Force in July 1942, Chennault's pilots compiled a record that stunned military observers. They were credited with destroying 296 enemy aircraft while losing only 14 pilots in combat. They achieved this flying, an aircraft considered inferior to the Japanese fighters they faced. They achieved it because Chennault understood a fundamental truth. Performance numbers on paper meant nothing. Tactical employment meant everything. The Zero was unbeatable in a turning fight at low speed, so they refused to fight at low speed. They fought at high speed, diving and climbing, using energy instead of maneuverability, refusing to play the game the Japanese expected. The term that emerged to describe this tactic was boom and zoom. Boom referred to the high-speed diving attack, the sudden strike from above. Zoom referred to the climb back to altitude using the energy gained in the dive. Boom and zoom inverted the traditional understanding of fighter combat. For 20 years since the First World War, fighter pilots believed that maneuverability was paramount. Victory went to the pilot who could turn tighter, get on his opponent's tail, and stay there. The Zero represented the ultimate expression of that philosophy, but boom and zoom rejected it entirely. The pilot who could control altitude and speed, who understood energy management, who had the discipline to attack once and disengage, that pilot would win, even in an inferior aircraft. This was not instinctive. It violated every fighter pilot's aggressive nature. When a Zero turned in front of you, every instinct screamed to follow it, to get on its tail, to shoot it down in a classic dogfight. Pilots who followed those instincts died. The pilots who survived were the ones who could suppress their instincts, who could dive past the Zero, resist the temptation to pull up and engage, and instead extend away, climbing back to altitude for another pass. It required discipline. It required trust in the tactic even when every nerve in your body demanded action. It required accepting that you might not get the kill, that the Zero might escape, that you would live to fight another day. The captured Zero at Akutan changed everything. On June 4, 1942, the same day as the Battle of Midway, a Japanese Zero flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga crash landed on Akutan Island in the Aleutians. Koga died in the crash, but the aircraft was intact. American forces found it a month later, nearly perfect, sitting in the Alaskan tundra like a gift from the aviation gods. They shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, repaired it, and by September 1942 they were flying it. Test pilots wrung out the Zero, pushing it to its limits, measuring its performance in every regime of flight. The data confirmed what Chennault and Thach had learned through blood and intuition. The Zero was magnificent at low speeds. Its light-wing loading and efficient airfoil allowed it to turn inside any American fighter when both aircraft were flying slow. But at high speeds, above 200 knots, the Zero became a different aircraft. The ailerons became heavy and unresponsive. Roll rate dropped dramatically. The Zero rolled much more easily to the left than to the right due to engine torque effects. At speeds above 250 miles per hour, an American fighter could outroll the Zero. This was critical. In a high-speed diving attack, the attacking pilot needed to roll into firing position quickly. The Zero could not. The American pilot could dive, roll, fire, and roll away before the Zero could respond. The Akutan Zero also confirmed the engine cutout under negative Gs. Push the stick forward, create negative acceleration, and the float carburetor would starve the engine of fuel. For 3 or 4 seconds, the Zero became a glider. In aerial combat, 3 seconds was an eternity. The information from the Akutan Zero went immediately to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. Tactics were refined. Training emphasized high-speed attack runs and energy management. Pilots learned specific techniques. Dive on the Zero from above. Fire a burst from 600 feet, no closer. Roll hard right because the Zero struggles to roll right. Extend away in the dive using superior diving speed. If a Zero gets on your tail, dive and push forward on the stick to create negative Gs. Climb back to altitude using energy from the dive. Repeat. Never, under any circumstances, try to turn with a Zero at low speed. These tactics were codified in training films. They became doctrine. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the kill ratio of F-4F Wildcats against Zeros had climbed to 5.9 to 1. The Wildcat was not a better aircraft than the Zero in terms of raw performance, but flown according to boom and zoom principles, using altitude and speed, the Wildcat won. The system that supported this tactical revolution was as important as the tactics themselves. American radar gave defending fighters advance warning, allowing them to climb to altitude before the Japanese arrived. The Coast Watcher network in the Solomon Islands provided early warning of Japanese raids from Rabaul. American pilots consistently held the altitude advantage. They could dictate the terms of engagement. The Japanese, flying long distances from their bases, arrived at medium altitude, already at a disadvantage. American training systems produced pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time before they entered combat. They received extensive instruction in gunnery, formation tactics, and energy management. The United States pulled its best combat pilots out of frontline service and sent them back to training commands to teach new pilots. This created a virtuous cycle. Each generation of pilots was better trained than the last. Experience accumulated institutionally, not just in individual pilots. The Japanese made the opposite choice. Their best pilots stayed in combat until they were killed. By mid-1942, The cadre of superbly trained pre-war Japanese naval aviators began to die in the skies over the Pacific. Their replacements received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 100 hours of flight time before combat. They flew aircraft that were unforgiving of mistakes, that provided no protection from error. Inexperienced pilots in Zeros died quickly. The industrial dimension was equally decisive. American aircraft factories produced fighters in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese production. The Wildcat alone saw nearly 8,000 units built. Grumman would produce over 12,000 F-6F Hellcats during the war. At peak production, Grumman turned out one Hellcat every hour, around the clock. Japan produced approximately 10,000 Zeros during the entire war. The mathematics of attrition became inescapable. Even if kill ratios were even, which they were not, America could replace losses faster than Japan. But the kill ratios were not even, they heavily favored the Americans. In September 1943, the F-6F Hellcat entered combat. If the Wildcat had forced the Japanese to rethink air combat, the Hellcat sealed their fate. The F-6F was designed from the beginning to fight the Zero using boom and zoom tactics. It was larger than the Wildcat, heavier, more powerful. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Wildcat's output. Top speed was 380 miles per hour. Rate of climb was excellent. Dive speed was exceptional. The Hellcat accelerated in a dive like nothing the Japanese had encountered. Most importantly, the Hellcat possessed the structural strength to pull out of steep dives at high speeds without the airframe failing. Zero pilots who tried to follow a Hellcat into a dive risked tearing their wings off. The Hellcat had the Wildcat's ruggedness and added overwhelming power. Armor protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. The airframe could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. Japanese pilots reported hitting Hellcats repeatedly only to watch them fly away. The Americans reported that Zeros typically exploded or caught fire after a single burst of 50 caliber fire. The Hellcat's armament was devastating. 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition. A 2-second burst from a Hellcat fired 130 rounds. The Zero's thin skin and unprotected fuel tanks could not withstand that firepower. Hellcat pilots used the same boom and zoom tactics pioneered by the Flying Tigers and refined by Wildcat pilots. But the Hellcat's performance made those tactics easier to execute and far more deadly. The Hellcat dove faster, climbed faster, accelerated faster. It could dictate engagement ranges, choosing when to fight and when to disengage. The Zero could not catch it in level flight, could not follow it in a dive, could not escape it in a climb. The Hellcat dominated every phase of flight except low-speed turning, and Hellcat pilots knew better than to turn. On November 23, 1943, Hellcats engaged Zeros over Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. The Americans shot down 30 Zeros for the loss of one Hellcat. The kill ratio of 30-1 sent shockwaves through Japanese naval aviation. This was not combat, this was slaughter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete collapse of Japanese air power. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 2 days, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed more than 600 Japanese aircraft. The Japanese lost 3 carriers. American losses totaled 103 aircraft, most to operational accidents, not combat. Hellcats flying from 15 American carriers tore apart Japanese attack formations before they could reach the fleet. The boom and zoom tactics, executed by well-trained pilots in superior aircraft, supported by radar direction and effective communications, created a killing field in the sky. Japanese pilots, many with less than 200 hours of flight time, flew into a wall of fire and disappeared. The experienced pilots who might have adapted to American tactics were already dead, killed in earlier battles. By late 1944, the Zero was obsolete. New Japanese fighters like the Kawanishi N1K and Nakajima Ki-84 had better performance, but they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. The Zero continued to serve because Japan had nothing else. It became the primary aircraft for kamikaze attacks, its long range and simplicity making it suitable for one-way missions. The transformation was complete. The fighter that once dominated the Pacific skies, that seemed unbeatable, that struck fear into every Allied pilot, now served best as a suicide weapon. This was not because the Zero was a bad aircraft, it was an excellent aircraft, brilliantly designed for a specific tactical doctrine. But that doctrine assumed fights would occur on the Zero's terms, at low speeds, in turning engagements where its maneuverability dominated. The Americans refused to fight on those terms. The pilots who survived told similar stories. They talked about discipline, about resisting the temptation to follow a Zero into a turn, about trusting your wingman out, energy management, climbing and diving, using speed and altitude instead of turning radius. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, all in the Hellcat, said the F-6F was rugged, stable, easy to maintain, but what he remembered most was that it brought pilots home. That calculation, the ability to survive, to fly another mission, to accumulate experience, changed the mathematics of combat. A pilot who could survive 10 missions learned far more than a pilot who died on his first. Experience compounded. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the few to survive the war, wrote about the frustration of fighting the Thach Weave. He described watching a squadron mate pursue an American fighter, only to find himself under attack from the wingman. The Americans always worked in pairs. They never fought alone. They refused to be drawn into individual duels. Sakai respected the tactic even as it killed his comrades. He understood that the Americans had solved the Zero problem, not with a better aircraft, though eventually they had that too, but with better tactics and better systems. Another Japanese pilot, interviewed after the war, described the shock of encountering Hellcats for the first time. The speed difference was overwhelming. The Japanese formations, designed for mutual support in turning fights, became death traps when American fighters dove through at 400 miles per hour, fired, and climbed away before anyone could respond. The tactical revolution that defeated the Zero rested on several foundations. First, the willingness to analyze the enemy objectively, to understand both strengths and weaknesses without emotion or prejudice. Chennault, Thach, and other American tacticians studied the Zero carefully. They acknowledged its superiority in certain flight regimes, but they also identified its vulnerabilities. Second, the discipline to develop and follow tactics that exploited those vulnerabilities, even when those tactics violated traditional fighter doctrine. Boom and zoom felt wrong to pilots raised on dogfighting traditions, but it worked. Third, the institutional commitment to training that produced pilots capable of executing complex tactics under stress. Fourth, the industrial capacity to produce aircraft in numbers that made attrition sustainable. Fifth, the technological infrastructure of radar, radio communications, and intelligence networks that gave American pilots situational advantages. But the most important factor was the American willingness to adapt. When tactics were not working, they changed them. When the Wildcat proved inadequate, they designed the Hellcat. When Japanese tactics evolved, American tactics evolved faster. The Imperial Japanese Navy, by contrast, remained committed to tactics that had worked early in the war. They continued to emphasize individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability long after those advantages had evaporated. They kept their best pilots in combat until they died rather than cycling them back to training commands. They could not replace aircraft losses fast enough. They could not train pilots fast enough. The system was inflexible, and inflexibility in war is fatal. The Zero's defeat was not the defeat of an aircraft, it was the defeat of a philosophy. The Japanese believed that offensive spirit, superior pilot skill, and aircraft performance would win battles. They built an aircraft that embodied that belief. For a time, it worked brilliantly. But when confronted with an enemy who refused to fight on those terms, who built systems instead of relying on individual excellence, who valued survivability as much as performance, the philosophy collapsed. The Americans did not defeat the Zero by building a more maneuverable fighter. They defeated it by refusing to turn. They defeated it with discipline, with tactics, with training, with numbers, with infrastructure. They defeated it by understanding that wars are not won by individual combats, but by systems that consistently produce favorable outcomes. By the end of the war, American fighters had shot down over 15,000 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific theater. The F-6F Hellcat alone was credited with 5,156 kills, at a loss of 270 aircraft in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 19-1. The F-4F Wildcat achieved a kill ratio of 6.9-1. The P-40 Warhawk, in the hands of Flying Tigers and other units in the China-Burma-India theater, contributed nearly 1,000 kills. These numbers represented more than tactical victories. They represented the systematic dismantling of Japanese air power through the application of superior tactics, training, production, and institutional learning. The lessons of the boom and zoom revolution extended beyond World War II. Modern fighter tactics still emphasize energy management over turning performance. Fourth and fifth generation fighters possess thrust-to-weight ratios that allow them to climb vertically, to accelerate in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to World War II pilots. But the principles remain the same. Control the engagement geometry. Dictate the terms of combat. Attack from positions of advantage. Disengage when conditions are unfavorable. Use superior systems and support structures to create tactical advantages. The names have changed. They call it BVR combat now, beyond visual range, fighting with radar and missiles from dozens of miles away. But the fundamental concept is identical. Fight on your terms, not the enemy's. The Zero remained in limited service after the war, primarily with air forces that could not afford modern jets. A few survive today in museums and private collections, carefully restored, symbols of an era when air combat was personal and immediate, when pilots saw their opponents' faces across a few hundred feet of sky. The Hellcat largely disappeared after the war, scrapped or sold for pennies because it had no civilian use. The ones that remain are rare, treasured by warbird collectors who fly them at air shows. The distinctive sound of the R2800 engine, a reminder of American industrial might. But the tactics that defeated the Zero, the revolution in fighter doctrine that Chennault and Thach and thousands of other pilots forged in combat, those tactics never went away. They evolved, they adapted to new technologies. But they remained. There is something deeply human in this story. The Zero was designed by brilliant engineers who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Japanese pilots who flew it were among the most skilled in the world, trained to a standard few could match. And for a time, the combination dominated the Pacific skies. But skill and engineering are not enough when the enemy refuses to fight the way you expect. The Americans did not match Japanese pilot training hour for hour. They could not build a fighter that turned like a Zero. Instead, they changed the game. They built a system that produced adequate pilots in large numbers. They developed tactics that negated the Zero's advantages. They designed aircraft that excelled in the flight regimes those tactics required. They created an infrastructure of radar, communications, and intelligence that gave their pilots every advantage. And they outproduced the Japanese so dramatically that even unfavorable exchange rates would have been sustainable. Wars are not won by the side with the best individual warriors or the most elegant weapons. They are won by the side with better systems, better adaptability, better institutional learning. The Zero was a masterpiece of aircraft design. War! Systems win wars. The boom and zoom revolution was a systems victory. It was pilots learning from each other, sharing what worked, refining tactics through trial and error and blood. It was engineers designing aircraft to support those tactics. It was trainers teaching those tactics to thousands of new pilots. It was factories building the aircraft to execute those tactics. It was radar operators guiding fighters to intercept points. It was coast watchers reporting enemy movements. It was the entire apparatus of American military and industrial power focused on a single problem and solving it. The story of boom and zoom is also a story about humility. The Americans entered the war with inferior fighters and less experienced pilots. They could have despaired. Instead, they learned. They studied their enemy. They adapted their tactics. They acknowledged their weaknesses and found ways to compensate. There is no shame in flying a slower, less maneuverable fighter. There is only shame in flying it stupidly. The American pilots who survived the early battles were the ones who swallowed their pride, who refused to dogfight even when their instincts demanded it, who flew home with Zeros still in the sky because they knew that living pilots learned and dead pilots did not. This is the ultimate lesson of the campaign against the Zero. Technology matters, training matters, numbers matter. But what matters most is the willingness to cease to adapt quickly, to learn constantly. The Japanese built a beautiful fighter and a superb pilot training system and then stopped innovating. They assumed their early advantages would persist. They did not. The Americans built adequate equipment and adequate training and then obsessively improved both. They never stopped asking how to do it better. They never stopped learning. In the end, that made all the difference. The skies over the Pacific became an American domain, not because American fighters were faster or more maneuverable, but because American pilots refused to fight on Japanese terms, and because America built the systems to support that refusal. That is how the Zero, the most feared fighter of 1942, became a footnote by 1945. Not because it was defeated in fair combat, but because fair combat became impossible. The human cost of this learning curve was written in the logbooks of squadrons across the Pacific. Marine Fighting Squadron 21, stationed at Guadalcanal in August 1942, lost 14 pilots in their first month of operations. Most died trying to turn with Zeros. By October, after survivors absorbed the boom and zoom doctrine, their losses dropped by half while their kill claims doubled. The pilots who lived were not necessarily more skilled than those who died. They were more disciplined. They understood that survival was not about individual courage or flying ability. It was about systematic application of sound tactical principles. The psychological dimension of this transformation cannot be overstated. Fighter pilots are aggressive by nature. The entire culture of fighter aviation celebrates offensive action, dogfighting prowess, individual skill. Boom and zoom required suppressing those instincts. It required accepting that sometimes the correct action was to disengage, to let the enemy escape, to climb away and reset for another attack. For pilots raised on stories of World War I aces and swirling dogfights, this felt like cowardice. It took extraordinary moral courage to dive past a Zero, to resist pulling up into a turn, to fly away while the enemy was still there. The pilots who mastered this discipline were the ones who accumulated kills. More importantly, they were the ones who lived long enough to teach others. The transformation of American fighter doctrine between 1942 and 1943 represented one of the fastest institutional learning curves in military history. In 12 months, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps went from losing pilots at unsustainable rates to achieving air superiority over the most experienced naval air force in the world. This happened not because of a dramatic technological breakthrough, though better aircraft helped. It happened because thousands of individuals, from pilots to tacticians to engineers to trainers, worked within a system that valued learning and adaptation over tradition and doctrine. The Japanese system, equally skilled at the outset, lacked this flexibility. Japanese fighter tactics in 1944 looked much like Japanese fighter tactics in 1941. American fighter tactics evolved constantly. Consider the infrastructure that supported boom and zoom tactics. American aircraft carriers deployed sophisticated radar systems that could detect incoming raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter direction officers, stationed in combat information centers deep within the carriers, used this information to vector defending fighters to intercept points. They could guide fighters to altitude advantages, positioning them above incoming raids before the enemy arrived. The Japanese had radar technology but deployed it far less effectively. Japanese carriers typically lacked dedicated fighter direction capabilities. Zero pilots often flew without radios or with radios they did not trust. They relied on visual signals and individual initiative. Against coordinated American formations guided by radar and radio, operating according to standardized tactical doctrine, individual initiative was not enough. The Coastwatcher network in the Solomon Islands exemplified the American approach to systematic advantage. Australian and New Zealand personnel, along with local islanders, maintained hidden observation posts throughout Japanese-held territory. When Japanese bombers lifted off from Rabaul heading for Guadalcanal, coastwatchers radioed warnings. American fighters at Henderson Field received 2 hours' notice. They climbed to 25,000 feet and waited. The Japanese arrived at 15,000 feet, exhausted from the long flight, and flew into an ambush. This was not luck. This was system design. The Japanese could have built similar networks. They chose not to. They believed in the superiority of their aircraft and pilots. They believed offensive spirit mattered more than systematic preparation. They were wrong. The mechanics who maintained American fighters were part of this system. They worked around the clock in brutal conditions, on jungle airstrips and carrier decks, keeping aircraft flying. Grumman designed the Wildcat and Hellcat for maintainability. Major components could be removed and replaced quickly. Engines could be changed in hours rather than days. This meant higher aircraft availability rates, more fighters available for combat sorties, more opportunities to achieve favorable exchange ratios. Japanese aircraft, including the Zero, were engineered for performance, not maintenance. They required specialized tools and skilled technicians and extensive time for major repairs. On forward airfields with limited facilities, this meant lower availability rates, fewer aircraft available to counter American attacks. The cumulative effect over months of operations was decisive. American pilot training evolved continuously. When boom and zoom tactics proved effective, they were incorporated into training curricula within weeks. Training films showing proper execution of high-speed diving attacks circulated throughout the fleet. Veteran pilots returning from combat deployments spent time at training commands, passing on lessons learned. Fighter squadrons practiced the Thach Weave until it became instinctive. They practiced energy management, learning to feel when the aircraft had sufficient speed for a zoom climb, when to extend away from a fight, when altitude advantage was sufficient for an attack. These were not abstract concepts, they were muscle memory, built through hundreds of hours of practice. Japanese pilot training, superb at the war's outset, deteriorated as fuel became scarce and experienced instructors died in combat. By 1944, some Japanese pilots received less than 100 hours of total flight time before combat. They flew aircraft that were unforgiving of error. The mathematics were brutal. The Zero itself was not a static design. Mitsubishi introduced improved versions throughout the war. The A6M featured a more powerful engine and modified wings. The A6M added engine power and strengthened the airframe for higher diving speeds. Later variants incorporated some armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. Adding armor and protected fuel tanks increased weight, reducing the maneuverability that made the Zero dangerous. Strengthening the airframe for higher speeds increased structural weight further. By 1944, the Zero had better survivability than its predecessors, but it had lost much of the performance edge that made it feared. And American fighters had leapt ahead in capability. The industrial context framed everything. In 1943, Grumman's Bethpage, New York facility produced Hellcats at a rate that seemed impossible. At peak production, one aircraft rolled off the assembly line every hour, 24 per day, nearly 700 per month. Workers, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before, built these aircraft with extraordinary precision. Quality control was rigorous. Each aircraft was tested extensively before delivery. This production rate meant that American carriers never lacked fighters. Losses could be replaced within days. Entire squadrons could be re-equipped with new aircraft in a week. Japan's entire aircraft industry produced fewer fighters in a month than Grumman alone produced. This disparity was not about one company or one aircraft type. It reflected the total industrial capacity of the two nations. The rubber and fuel supply issues that plagued Japan from 1943 onward created cascading effects. Less fuel meant less flight training for new pilots. Rubber shortages meant fewer tires for aircraft, creating maintenance bottlenecks. Aluminum became scarce, slowing production. The naval blockade that American submarines imposed on Japanese shipping meant that raw materials could not reach factories, and finished aircraft could not reach forward bases. Zeros shot down over the Pacific could not be replaced. Experienced pilots killed in combat could not be replaced. The Japanese system was optimized for short, decisive campaigns. It was not built for extended attritional warfare against an enemy with vast industrial resources. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of its former capability, not because of any single defeat, but because of systemic collapse. The Battle of the Philippine Sea exposed this reality with horrifying clarity. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carriers launched massive strikes against the American fleet. 400 aircraft attacked in waves. American radar detected them at long range. Fighter direction officers vectored more than 400 Hellcats to intercept points. The Japanese formations flew into a wall of American fighters, executing perfect boom and zoom attacks. The Hellcats dove through the Japanese formations at 400 miles per hour, fired, climbed back to altitude, and dove again. Japanese pilots, many on their first combat mission, could not respond. They had been trained in turning tactics that were useless against these attacks. Their Zeros could not follow the Hellcats into their dives, could not catch them in climbs, could not escape. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down that day. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, most to operational accidents. Pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was apt. It was not combat. It was systematic destruction. Admiral Mark Mitscher, commanding Task Force 58, the American carrier force, understood what this meant. Japanese naval aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The Imperial Navy still had carriers, still had aircraft, still had pilots. This changed the fundamental calculus of the Pacific War. Without air cover, Japanese surface forces were vulnerable. Without the ability to strike American carriers, Japan could not prevent amphibious invasions. The path to the Japanese home islands lay open. All of this flowed from a tactical revolution that began with Claire Chennault working out formations on a chalkboard in China, and John Thach moving matchsticks on his kitchen table in California. The story of boom and zoom is ultimately about the nature of innovation under pressure. Both sides entered the war with experienced pilots and capable aircraft. Both sides suffered losses and learned lessons. But only one side built a system that could absorb those lessons, disseminate them rapidly, and implement changes at scale. The American military was not inherently more innovative than the Japanese military. But American military culture valued adaptation over tradition, results over doctrine, systematic learning over individual excellence. This created a learning organization that improved continuously. Japanese military culture valued tradition, hierarchy, and the perfection of existing methods. When those methods failed, the system struggled to adapt. There is a deeper lesson here about technological competition and industrial warfare. The Zero was a more capable aircraft than the Wildcat in most measurable categories. In a one-on-one turning fight between equally skilled pilots, the Zero won. But wars are not fought as one-on-one duels. They are fought as complex systems competing against each other. The side with the better system wins, even if individual components are inferior. The American system for training pilots, developing tactics, producing aircraft, maintaining equipment, gathering intelligence, and adapting to changing circumstances proved superior to the Japanese system. The boom and zoom revolution was the expression of that systemic superiority at the tactical level. It was not one brilliant insight, but thousands of small improvements, implemented consistently, accumulated over time. The veterans of these battles carried their experiences differently. American pilots who survived often spoke about their aircraft with affection mixed with pragmatism. The Wildcat was slow but tough. The Hellcat was not beautiful, but it worked. They spoke about tactics, about discipline, about trusting your wingman. They understood that their survival depended not on individual heroics, but on systematic execution of sound principles. Japanese pilots who survived spoke about the Zero with something approaching reverence. It was a beautiful aircraft, perfectly balanced, responsive to the slightest touch. They spoke about the gradual erosion of capability as experienced pilots died and replacements proved inadequate. They spoke about the frustration of facing enemies who refused to fight honorably, who would not commit to turning engagements, who used speed and altitude instead of skill and courage. Neither perspective was wrong. They simply reflected different underlying philosophies about the nature of aerial combat. The technological trajectory that began with the Zero's dominance in 1941 and ended with its obsolescence by 1945 previewed patterns that would repeat throughout the jet age. Performance metrics alone do not determine victory. The MiG-15 was superior to the F-86 Sabre in most performance categories during the Korean War, yet American pilots achieved favorable kill ratios through superior tactics, training, and system support. The same pattern appeared in Vietnam, where North Vietnamese pilots flying MiG-17s and MiG-21s sometimes achieved tactical successes against faster, more heavily armed American fighters by forcing low-speed turning fights. The lesson was consistent. Fight on your terms, not the enemy's. Use systematic advantages to negate individual performance disparities. Build institutional learning into your organization. The boom and zoom doctrine represented more than tactical innovation. It represented a fundamental reimagining of what fighter combat could be. For 20 years, since the end of World War I, fighter pilots and aviation theorists had believed that maneuverability was paramount. The aircraft that could turn tightest would dominate. The pilot with the best flying skills would win. The Zero embodied this philosophy perfectly. But Chennault and Thach and thousands of American pilots proved that philosophy wrong. They demonstrated that energy management mattered more than turning ability. That systematic application of sound tactics mattered more than individual skill. That the pilot who lived to fight tomorrow was more valuable than the pilot who died achieving a heroic kill today. This reorientation of values, from individual excellence to systematic effectiveness, from offensive spirit to measured discipline, changed fighter aviation permanently. Modern fighter pilots still study the Thach Weave, not because they will use it in combat, though the principles remain sound. They study it because it represents clear thinking under pressure, creative problem solving, applied to operational challenges, and the courage to reject conventional wisdom when conventional wisdom leads to failure. The discipline required to execute boom and zoom tactics, to dive past an enemy and resist engaging, remains relevant even in an era of missiles and radar. The fundamental lesson endures. Victory comes not from fighting the way you want to fight, but from understanding both your capabilities and your opponent's capabilities so clearly that you can engineer situations where you hold every advantage. That kind of clarity requires institutional humility. It requires the willingness to learn from failure, to adapt quickly, to prioritize results over pride.